bank manager called the FBI to arrest a black woman for applying for a loan, but minutes later, in front of thousands watching live, every officer in the room was standing at attention, saluting her. The fluorescent lights of Midwest Trust Bank hummed faintly overhead, casting a cold glow over the marble floors and polished counters. It was 2:47 in the afternoon, the hour when most customers were in a quiet hurry to finish their business before closing. The steady whir of the ATM in the corner and the rhythmic chatter of the receipt printer filled the air, mundane, predictable sounds of a bank on an ordinary weekday. That was when Gerald Whitman's voice sliced through the room like a blade. "Ma'am, I need you to empty your pockets and step away from my desk now." His chair scraped sharply against the stone floor as he stood, the sound snapping every head in the lobby toward him. Gerald wasn't just speaking, he was performing. At 6'2", with a rigid posture honed from years of asserting authority, he pointed directly at the woman sitting across from him. She was dressed in faded jeans and a plain gray hoodie, the kind of outfit that blended into a crowd without a second glance. No jewelry, no makeup, no designer bag, nothing to hint at wealth or influence. And maybe that's exactly why Gerald's eyes narrowed with that particular brand of disdain, the kind reserved for people he had already decided didn't belong here. He reached into his desk drawer without breaking eye contact and pulled out a bottle of hand sanitizer. With slow, deliberate movements, he pressed the pump and let the gel pool into his palm, rubbing it in with a theatrical precision that made it clear this was part of the show. Customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The bank's security cameras captured every frame. But Gerald wasn't worried about cameras. He had been managing this branch for 23 years, and in his mind he knew trouble when he saw it. The woman didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly on a black leather portfolio in her lap. Her eyes stayed on him, not defiant, not pleading, just steady. That calmness was wrong for this moment. Most people would be fidgeting, explaining themselves, maybe even snapping back at the insult. She didn't move. Gerald took a step closer, letting his polished shoes click against the marble for effect. "People like you don't walk into banks like this asking for millions," he said, his voice pitched loud enough for the elderly woman at the next desk to hear. The phrase hung in the air, sharp and ugly, and a few customers instinctively reached for their phones. The sound of the ATM printer in the corner seemed suddenly louder, more intrusive, as if the entire room was waiting for the next blow. The woman, Amelia, shifted slightly in her chair, but her expression didn't change. It was the kind of composure that wasn't practiced for a moment like this. It was ingrained. She glanced briefly toward the digital clock above the teller windows, noting the time like someone keeping track of a schedule only she understood. Gerald's gaze swept over her one more time, looking for some sign of weakness, some flicker of fear he could exploit. There was none. "I said, empty your pockets," he repeated, his tone even sharper, as if volume alone could bend her will. The lobby had gone still, save for the faint clicking of keyboards and the distant shuffle of papers. Somewhere near the entrance, the security guard shifted his weight, his eyes flicking between Gerald and the woman, as if sensing that this wasn't just another policy enforcement. Gerald's hand hovered near the edge of his desk, ready to grab the phone. The way he saw it, this was a simple equation, his authority versus her audacity. But there was something he hadn't factored in, something resting quietly behind that calm stare. Amelia sat there, as if the outcome had already been decided in her favor, as if she knew exactly how this was going to end, and that knowledge made her silence more powerful than anything she could have said. The lobby of Midwest Trust Bank had gone so quiet it felt like a stage between acts. Every chair, every counter, every polished surface seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next line. Gerald Whitman was more than ready to deliver it. He planted his hands on the edge of his desk, leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry, and said, "In my 23 years here, I've learned to spot trouble the moment it walks in." The words were calculated for impact, loud enough to reach the far corner near the ATM, sharp enough to leave no doubt about who the trouble was. A few customers shifted in their seats, pretending to check their phones but angling them just enough to record. Near the corner, 17-year-old Zoe Chen froze for half a beat, then raised her phone and hit Go Live. Her heart thudded in her chest as the viewer count ticked upward almost immediately, 27, 59, 112. Comments began scrolling, quick and skeptical. "What's happening? Is this for real?" Gerald didn't notice her. He was too busy scanning the room to make sure everyone understood this was under his control. He straightened his tie and gave a small, dismissive gesture to the assistant manager lingering by the teller line. "I'll handle this," he said in that clipped, managerial tone that didn't invite discussion. It's a security matter. The words were meant for staff ears, but he didn't lower his voice. He wanted the customers to hear them too, wanted to frame the moment in their minds before anyone else could. On the other side of the lobby, Maria Gonzalez gripped the edge of her workstation. 18 months at this bank had taught her the unspoken rules. Don't contradict management in public. Don't get involved in situations you don't have to. But every instinct screamed at her that this was wrong. She kept her head down, her eyes flicking toward the woman in the hoodie, Amelia, and back to her computer screen, pretending to type while her stomach twisted. Mrs. Patterson, sitting primly at the desk nearest Gerald's, didn't pretend anything. Her perfectly coiffed hair and pearl earrings made her a fixture here, the kind of long-term customer whose name was known to every teller. She folded her hands over her handbag and watched Gerald with a tightening jaw, her expression shifting from curiosity to disapproval. Zoe's live stream ticked past 300 viewers. She adjusted her angle so the frame caught both Gerald's looming posture and Amelia's stillness. The contrast was striking, Gerald leaning in, voice rising in manufactured authority, and Amelia sitting like she had all the time in the world. The chat exploded with commentary. He's trying to humiliate her. What did she even do? Someone get his name. Gerald was feeding off the attention, mistaking the silence in the room for compliance. He spoke again, each word crisp. Ladies and gentlemen, we have protocols in place for situations like this. Protocols to protect our legitimate customers. He let the phrase hang there, heavy with implication. Amelia's eyes didn't leave his, her expression unreadable. The fluorescent lights caught the faintest reflection off the zipper of her leather portfolio, but she didn't move to open it. Her hands stayed steady in her lap. The hum of the bank's climate control filled the pause until Gerald broke it, glancing toward the security guard near the entrance. Stay alert, he ordered, though the guard had been watching intently since the first raised voice. The guard shifted his stance but said nothing. Across the lobby, Maria's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what Gerald was doing, turning the room into a jury before any evidence was presented. Frame the story first, and the rest falls into place. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. Zoe's viewer count hit 500. Comments flew by too fast to read. This is going viral. Gerald glanced around again, ensuring he still had the floor. In his mind, the situation was already decided. The woman in the hoodie was a problem, and he was the solution. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was how quickly the narrative was slipping from his hands, carried away by a glowing phone in the corner, and a growing audience far beyond these marble walls. The air in the bank felt tight, as if every molecule had drawn closer together. Phones were raised now, their small cameras all trained on the same point, Gerald Whitman standing over the woman in the hoodie. He reached across his desk and pulled the leather portfolio from her lap, flipping it open with a casual arrogance, his eyes skimming the first page before letting out a short, dismissive exhale. He turned another page without really reading it, then a third, before snapping the folder shut and sliding it back toward her with 2 fingers, as though it might leave a mark on him. I've seen enough, he said, not to her exactly, but to the room the way an actor might deliver a line to the audience instead of the other character. In the corner, Zoe Chen's livestream viewer count jumped past 8,000. Her phone buzzed from the sheer flood of comments. This is insane. He's not even looking at it. Somebody stop this. Mrs. Patterson, who had been sitting still with her hands folded, finally leaned forward. Mr. Whitman, she said, her voice calm but carrying across the lobby, don't you think it would be fair to at least review her application properly before making such statements? Gerald didn't even glance at her. Mrs. Patterson, he replied, his tone switching to that rehearsed politeness reserved for high-value customers. I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter of protocol. I'm protecting the bank's interests. He straightened, clearly satisfied with his own phrasing, and let his gaze return to Amelia as if Mrs. Patterson's intervention hadn't happened. Amelia sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the closed portfolio. She looked at him the way someone might look at a train schedule, patient, almost detached, as if timing was everything. Then she spoke, her voice low enough that the nearest customers had to lean in slightly to hear. Are you certain you want to make this call, Mr. Whitman? The question didn't rise or fall, it just existed in the space between them, a quiet counterweight to all his bluster. For a moment, it seemed to hang in the air, heavier than it should have been. Gerald blinked, and something almost imperceptible passed over his face, doubt maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He gave a small, sharp laugh and shook his head. "Yes," he said, as though answering a question only he could hear, and reached for the desk phone. The tension in the lobby ratcheted tighter. Maria Gonzalez froze behind the teller counter, her fingers resting on the keys of her computer without moving. The security guard shifted his weight again, watching Gerald's hand as it lifted the receiver. In the corner, Zoe's stream was alive with frantic text. Is she about to get arrested? What's happening? Someone tagged the news. Gerald began to dial, his eyes never leaving Amelia's face. Midwest Trust Bank, 455 Commerce Street. He recited when the dispatcher answered, his tone official, rehearsed. We have a suspicious individual attempting financial fraud. Black female, approximately 40, refuses to leave the premises after loan denial. The words were crisp, each one clipped into the air like the click of a lark. Amelia didn't interrupt, didn't shift in her chair. She only watched him, her expression still unreadable. Zoe's viewer count surged again, 10,000 now, the comments a blur. This is wrong, she didn't do anything. Somebody's filming, right? Mrs. Patterson's lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing as she looked from Gerald to Amelia and back. Gerald hung up the phone with a satisfied push of the button, then glanced toward the front doors. Officers will be here in 10 minutes, he announced, making sure everyone in the room heard it. He might as well have been telling them the ending of a story he believed he was writing alone. But there was something in the way Amelia's gaze didn't waver, in the slight tilt of her head, as if she were making a mental note, that suggested she knew another ending entirely. The kind of ending that could turn an entire room on its axis. The kind that made her question feel less like a warning and more like a promise. At exactly 3:28 p.m., the front doors of Midwest Trust Bank swung open with a soft chime, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The sound of their boots on the marble floor was deliberate, the kind that made conversations falter and heads turn. Officer Martinez, a 10-year veteran with a calm, assessing gaze, scanned the room first, while Officer Johnson, younger and more restless, followed half a step behind. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The customers who had been silently watching leaned forward, the ones holding phones adjusted their angles to capture every second. Gerald straightened in his chair, smoothing his tie, a look of vindication crossing his face, as if the cavalry had finally arrived. Martinez's eyes moved from the cluster of onlookers to Gerald's desk. His voice was measured, almost casual. We received a call about a possible fraud situation. Who's the individual in question? Gerald wasted no time. He lifted a hand and pointed across his desk. That would be her, he said, his tone clipped, his authority rehearsed. All eyes swung to Amelia, still seated in the same relaxed posture she had maintained since the first accusation. There was a pause, a long, deliberate pause that seemed to expand until it filled every corner of the room. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt quieter. Martinez looked at her, then back at Gerald, and something unspoken passed in that moment. Amelia reached slowly into her bag, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The leather creaked faintly as she drew out a black wallet, the kind used by law enforcement. She flipped it open with practiced precision, revealing a gold-embossed badge and a laminated ID card that caught the light just enough for the nearest phones to capture it clearly. Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Senior Compliance Officer. Martinez froze mid-step, posture shifting almost imperceptibly from neutral to attentive. He stepped closer, leaning just enough to verify the credentials. The holographic seal shimmered under the bank's lights, the microtext along the edges as crisp as a fingerprint. They were real. Behind him, Johnson's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. Martinez straightened and spoke in a tone that carried a weight completely absent from his entrance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now lined with respect. "Why didn't you say so?" Amelia's gaze flicked briefly toward Gerald before returning to Martinez. "Because," she said evenly, "I needed to see how you'd treat me if I wasn't." The sentence landed in the room like a gavel strike. A sharp exhale came from somewhere in the crowd. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. Gerald blinked twice, the smug certainty on his face draining away in increments. Zoe's livestream comments erupted into capital letters and fire emojis, the viewer count rocketing past 15,000 in seconds. Martinez's eyes narrowed, not at Amelia, but at Gerald. "Mr. Whitman," he began, his voice now carrying the subtle weight of someone who understood the stakes. "Did you know you were calling in a federal compliance officer on duty?" Gerald stammered. She didn't identify herself. Amelia's voice cut through his. "Federal investigators aren't required to announce themselves during active audits. That would defeat the purpose." Her tone was calm, matter of fact. There was no mistaking the undercurrent of control. She turned the wallet slightly so the crowd could see the badge before slipping it back into her bag. I've been conducting an unannounced compliance investigation into discrimination complaints filed against this branch, she continued. As of now, Mr. Whitman, you've been under federal observation for 41 minutes. A low murmur rippled through the lobby, the kind that carried both shock and a certain dark satisfaction. Martinez's attention shifted briefly to the phones recording every second. Everything that's happened here today, Amelia went on, has been documented, every word, every gesture, every witness reaction. She tapped the edge of the black leather portfolio in her lap, the same one Gerald had dismissed earlier. And it's all admissible as evidence. Gerald's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked from Amelia to the officers and back again, as if trying to find a reality where he still had control. But the power had already shifted, the center of gravity in the room no longer his to command. Martinez glanced at Johnson, then back to Amelia. "Do you require any assistance with your investigation, ma'am?" She nodded once. "Yes, please inform Special Agent Marcus Williams of the Financial Crimes Division that the situation is under control. He's been trying to reach me." She held up her phone. The missed calls from Williams plainly visible on the screen. A flash of recognition crossed Martinez's face. He turned toward Gerald with a look that was not unkind, but utterly without deference. "Sir, you might want to sit down." For the first time all afternoon, Gerald did as he was told. The lobby no longer felt like a bank. It felt like a controlled scene, every movement under a lens, every sound recorded. Phones were still up, their little red dots glowing, and Zoe Chen's live stream hovered near 20,000 viewers. The focus of every camera was Gerald's desk, where Amelia now sat like the conductor of an orchestra she'd been leading all along. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a thin stack of printed reports. The pages crisp and marked with highlighted rows. "Over the past 18 months, she began, her voice steady, this branch denied 67% of loan applications from black applicants. For white applicants with the same or lower credit profiles, that number was 12%. She didn't pause for gasps, though she got them. That's not a clerical error, that's a pattern." Her fingers tapped one of the sheets. "Here's a file from 3 months ago. A small business owner named Daniel Harris, local, clean credit history, no late payments in 15 years. His loan request was rejected without review. His only comment from this branch's management was that he didn't seem like a good fit for our clientele." She let the words hang there, the weight of them settling over the marble lobby. "Mr. Harris closed his shop 2 weeks later. His family has lived in this community for 3 generations." Looked directly at Gerald. "This isn't about one conversation today. This is about a system that's been allowed to operate without accountability." Kevin Walsh, the assistant manager, shifted behind the teller line. Amelia's gaze found him. "Mr. Walsh, you've been here for each of those 18 months. Did you ever raise concerns about these denial patterns?" Kevin swallowed, his eyes darting toward Gerald. Gerald is my supervisor. I didn't think." "Exactly." Amelia cut in. "You didn't think you could. That's how these systems survive. Silence becomes consent." The live stream chat exploded. "That's the line. She's killing him. Someone promote her now." Gerald's jaw was locked tight, his face a shade paler than it had been minutes before. Then the sharp trill of his desk phone cut through the air. He glanced at the caller ID and froze. President Robert Chen. The voice that came through was taut, clipped, with an edge of controlled panic. "Gerald, what is happening in my branch? My phone is blowing up with calls about some viral discrimination incident. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" Gerald tried to steady himself. "Sir, I was protecting the bank's interests. There was a suspicious—" "Stop," Chen snapped. "That woman you called the police on is a senior compliance officer for the Federal Reserve. Do you understand the scale of this disaster?" Silence. "Every news outlet in the city has this live stream. I'm getting calls from the board and federal regulators. Fix it, now." He didn't wait for a reply before hanging up. Amelia closed the folder in front of her, the sound of the pages snapping together unnaturally loud in the charged air. "For the record," she said, her voice carrying easily over the stillness, "this investigation was authorized weeks ago. Every minute of our interaction today has been recorded on federal-grade audio and video equipment." She reached into her bag and placed a small digital recorder on the desk, its red light still blinking. Every gesture, every comment, every witness reaction is documented. The cameras in the room seemed to lean closer. The live stream counter ticked upward again. It was no longer a confrontation, it was an indictment playing out live. The thud of helicopter rotors outside drew every eye to the wall of glass at the front of the bank. Through the swirling leaves and the glare of late afternoon sun, a sleek corporate aircraft touched down in the parking lot. News crews were already gathered, cameras rolling, the scene spilling onto sidewalks crowded with curious onlookers. The doors swung open and President Robert Chen strode in, flanked by two corporate attorneys and the bank's chief legal counsel, Sarah Kim. His usually composed expression was fractured by urgency. Behind him came Special Agent Marcus Williams of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, his presence quiet but undeniable. The lobby felt smaller as they approached Gerald's desk, every customer, every employee, every phone lens capturing the collision of power about to unfold. Amelia rose from her chair but did not step back. Her black portfolio rested on the desk like a sealed verdict. Chen stopped short of shaking her hand, his tone careful, deliberate. "Dr. Richardson, I want to extend my deepest." She lifted a hand, stopping him. "Mr. Chen, we'll dispense with formalities. We have documented multiple violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, patterns of discriminatory lending, and obstruction of a federal compliance investigation. This discussion will be public, as the investigation began in public." One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Chen glanced at Williams, who remained impassive. "What do you propose?" Amelia opened her portfolio, sliding a prepared document across the desk. "Two options. Option 1, immediate federal intervention. Your assets are frozen, the Department of Justice takes over, and your federal banking charter is in jeopardy. Option 2, comprehensive compliance restructuring under continuous federal oversight." She paused, letting the silence frame her words. "Option 2 comes with non-negotiable conditions." Williams stepped forward, his voice low but carrying, "Fight the terms, and you fight the United States government." The words landed with the kind of weight no boardroom negotiation could match. Amelia's tone stayed steady, almost clinical. "First, the immediate termination and permanent industry ban of all personnel involved in discriminatory practices. That includes Gerald Whitman and assistant manager Kevin Walsh." Kevin flinched where he stood. Gerald stared straight ahead, jaw locked. "Second," Amelia continued, "the establishment of a $5 million community development fund dedicated to minority-owned business loans, administered by an independent body with quarterly reporting to federal regulators. Third, mandatory bias and compliance training for all employees, with quarterly testing and automatic termination for failure. Fourth, installation of real-time discrimination monitoring software, directly reporting to federal oversight offices. Fifth, quarterly community audits conducted by independent civil rights organizations with results made public." She closed the folder. "These measures begin immediately upon your signature." Chen's gaze shifted between Amelia and Williams, calculating the cost of resistance. The attorneys whispered furiously, but Chen's posture was stiff with the knowledge that neither option favored him. "If we refuse?" he asked. Though the question sounded hollow, Williams answered before Amelia could. "Then your bank's charter will be suspended pending criminal investigations, and you personally may face charges under federal civil rights statutes. You'll be finished before the week ends." The cameras caught everything, the stillness, the faint tightening at the corners of Chen's eyes, the recognition of a man cornered. He took the pen Amelia offered and signed. The click of it returning to the desk was louder than it should have been. Amelia turned to the crowd. "Effective immediately, Maria Gonzalez is promoted to branch manager. Her first task will be implementing these compliance requirements." Maria's eyes widened, a hand flying to her mouth before she managed a nod. The live stream comments surged, a flood of congratulations and disbelief. Chen looked at Amelia, his voice lower now. "We'll comply." She met his gaze without blinking. "You'll be monitored." Around them, the lobby seemed to exhale. For the first time since 2:47 p.m., the power in the room no longer belonged to Gerald Whitman or the institution whose name was etched into the marble above the doors. It belonged to the woman in the hoodie, the federal badge in her bag, and the evidence she carried. Chen understood the truth in that moment. If he had walked out without signing, he'd lose everything in days. By signing, he kept the bank alive, but chained to federal oversight for years. There was no victory here for him, only survival. And survival, in front of thousands watching live, looked very different from control. 6 weeks later, Midwest Trust Bank's Commerce Street branch looked and felt like an entirely different place. The marble counters were the same, but the atmosphere had shifted, lighter, warmer, with customers greeted by name and staff moving with a confidence rooted in trust rather than fear. Maria Gonzalez now wore a tailored blazer with a simple gold nameplate that read Branch Manager. Her desk, once a silent observer's perch, had become the hub of transparent operations. On one wall, a digital display cycled through real-time loan approval rates by demographic, community outreach metrics, and updates on the $5 million development fund. David Torres had traded his security post for the title of Community Relations Coordinator, his military posture now channeled into handshakes with small business owners, veterans, and first-time homebuyers. The development fund had already backed more than 40 minority-owned enterprises, restaurants, tech startups, local service providers, breathing life into streets that had long been starved of investment. That morning, Maria reviewed a new application from a young entrepreneur with a modest coffee shop plan. "We can approve this in 24 hours, she said, signing the file and passing it to David. In the corner of the lobby, Mrs. Patterson waited for her appointment, smiling faintly at the transformation she had witnessed from the front row. Outside, under a sky washed clean by overnight rain, Gerald Whitman walked slowly down the sidewalk carrying a cardboard box. Inside were the last remnants of his 23-year career, a framed certificate, a mug with the bank's logo, a few personal pens. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose. As he stepped past the glass doors, Mrs. Patterson's eyes caught his through the reflection. He hesitated, just long enough for her to speak. "No," she said softly but firmly, "it wasn't protocol, it was prejudice." The words seemed to land heavier than the box in his hands. He turned away without a response, disappearing into the late morning foot traffic. Kevin Walsh hadn't been seen at the branch since that day. Word had it he was working the customer service line at a small credit union across town, answering phones, processing forms. Far from the management track he had once imagined. But the impact of Amelia's investigation didn't end with Gerald and Kevin. Across the city, other bank branches had begun quietly reviewing their own practices, retraining staff, and installing monitoring systems, determined to avoid the kind of federal spotlight that had scorched Commerce Street. Some did it out of genuine reform, others out of fear. Either way, the change was spreading. Customers noticed, communities noticed, and in a way that no one could deny, the balance of power in those quiet marble lobbies had begun to shift. 2 years later, the ripples from that afternoon on Commerce Street had reached every corner of the country. Dr. Amelia Richardson now served as the Director of National Banking Compliance, overseeing investigations in all 50 states. Her unannounced audit method, walking into a branch, observing in real time, documenting without revealing her role, had become the gold standard for federal civil rights enforcement in the financial sector. Banks across the nation had adapted or been forced to adapt. Lending bias was down by 60% nationwide. Investment in minority-owned businesses had surged, with billions flowing into communities that had long been bypassed. The numbers told one story, but the people told another. Zoe Chen, whose live stream captured the turning point, had become a respected investigative reporter. Her footage of that day sat in the Smithsonian Civil Rights Archive, shown to visitors as an example of citizen journalism's power. Maria Gonzalez now managed 7 branches, each one run with the same transparent, community-focused practices she had established on Commerce Street. She trained other managers to view diversity not as a quota, but as the foundation of sustainable business. Mrs. Patterson had taken a seat on the Federal Reserve's Community Advisory Board, her voice shaping policy from a position she never imagined for herself. In hearings and public forums, she spoke of the moment she realized that a single customer's refusal to stay silent could change the course of an institution. The twist was how small the spark had been. A 17-year-old with a phone and the courage to hit go live. A woman in a hoodie who chose to remain seated and let the truth document itself. Together, they had ignited a reform movement that rewrote policy and culture in an industry that had believed itself untouchable. The legacy was visible not just in reports and regulations, but in neighborhoods with new storefronts, in families holding keys to homes once denied to them, in job postings from companies funded by loans that would have been rejected before. Commerce Street had become a case study taught in law schools, business programs, and civil rights seminars. The marble lobby, where it began, still stood, but now as a model of inclusion, with real-time bias monitoring on display for anyone to see. For all the grand titles and sweeping statistics, the heart of the story remained simple: One moment, one choice, one refusal to accept injustice. And in that simplicity lay the proof that anyone, anywhere, could be the start of something bigger than themselves. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.